Good Vach, everybody. Thank you so much for joining our webinar, and thank you to you, Rabbi Carlebach. Rabbi Carlebach is now going to start this part of the series is on the Rebbe. The Rebbe was born in 1902, the 11th of Nisan, 1902, and in 1950, at the age of 48, became Rebbe. That was just 5 years after the Holocaust. The Rebbe was responsible for revolutionizing Yiddishkeit, rebuilding Judaism after the destruction of the Holocaust. Rabbi Carlebach, I want to thank you. I love listening to you every week. I think your knowledge of the history of the Rabbeim is unbelievable. But this is such an important part of the program to hear the Rebbe's life story. So thank you for doing this, and over to you. Good Vach.
Good Vach, Rabbi Masinta. Thank you once again for the opportunity.
I think you're on mute, eh? Can't hear you.
No? Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
Okay. Thank you. So thank you. Good Vach, everybody. And as Rabbi Masinta said, we're going to speak about our Holy Rebbe and above all the activities we can be involved in to bring Mashiach that much closer. But today we're going to do a kind of a sandwich. I'm going to start off with a story, end off with a story, and in between we'll talk about the activities and the organizations set up that were used as vehicles for the previous Rebbe and the Rebbe's activities since the previous Rebbe came to America in 1940. Last week was Yud Shevat, and as Rabbi Masinta already mentioned, that is the anniversary both of the previous Rebbe's passing as well as our Rebbe's acceptance. The official acceptance as Rebbe was exactly 1 year later on Yud Shevat 1951, although in between that year it was already unofficial that he would take over the Nesius. So tonight I'd like to focus our stories on the fact that we find ourselves in very trying times. Physically, we cannot see the Rebbe in that sense. And before 1994, everyone knew you had a situation, you went to the Rebbe, you wrote to the Rebbe, and his blessings would certainly be effective. The question is what to do since then. And that's what I'd like to focus on in our stories. And the Rebbe himself addressed that. We spoke about last week, Yud Shevat 1950 was the yahrzeit of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe. And after he passed away, a chassid turned to our Rebbe and he said, he wrote a letter with the question we just asked. And the Rebbe wrote back, what should one do when in doubt? Because he feels it's not possible to ask the Frierdikke Rebbe, the previous Rebbe now. No, says the Rebbe, if you will remain steadfast in your hiskashness, in your connection to him, without paying attention to the arguments of the Yetzer Hara, and you will send your question to the Ohel, the gravesite of our Rebbes, the Rebbe will find a way to answer you. There's no question about it. And so, as I mentioned, I'd like to tell, first of all, a story of someone who was in that situation and wrote, and it's a firsthand story, actually. There, a chassid says, his name is Benny Vaxberger. His family were Seret Vishnitzer Hasidim who lived in Israel. They have a very famous Judaica business, and today he still lives in Israel. But at the time that the story took place was years ago. He was working in a place called Postville, Iowa. There is a chassid by the name of Rab Shlomo Mordechai Rabashkin. Many have heard about him. You could look his story up. And he started the biggest kosher meat plant in Postville, Iowa. And he wanted families to move there so there will be enough children to have a cheder, and then he would start an entire community there. Postville is a small, isolated village, hours from the closest Jewish community. And at the time that it started, eventually it became quite a community, but at the time that it started was a very small place. And so this Rabbeim Vaxberger says he was one of the first to move there with his wife. And Reb Shalmardcha was grateful to us. Over the years, we became good friends and would spend many long hours in conversation. And he made a weekly Malava Malka, to which this Benny was always there. They were living in Postville, and after 4 years, they had not been blessed with children. We consulted with doctors and looked into countless forms of treatment. Nothing helped. We grew more desperate as time passed. And to make things worse, he says, my wife was feeling very lonely, cut off from her family. Our efforts led us to consider certain treatments that were being developed in Israel. And they managed to organize an appointment with a top fertility doctor there. My wife, he says, wanted to leave for Israel immediately. But as my job included a bit of everything at the factory, he was shechting the chickens, turkeys, cows, and sheep, and everything else they produced. And it was right before Tishrei, the busiest season of the meat plant. I didn't feel comfortable leaving Reb Shalmardcha short a shechet. So I suggested to my wife, he says, let's leave after Sukkot. And after Simchas Torah, we'll go to Israel. That Simchas Torah was extremely joyous in Postville. There were only about 25 people there, plenty of l'chaim. The dancing went on all day. And the next segment of this story is told by Rabbi Frierdikke Rebbe. He says, I recall that Simchas Torah clearly. It was celebrated in true Postville style. Dancing, singing, farbrengen. We were all very uplifted. During the dancing, says Reb Shalmardcha, I walked onto the front porch for a small break, something which I hardly ever do, and bumped into Rebbeinu. He looked a little too serious for Simchas Torah, as if something was bothering him. I approached him. I invited him back inside to join the dancing. He refused, and so we stayed outside and chatted. He told me he's leaving after Yom Tov to go to Eretz Yisrael. And he said because he needs medical help for his children, they had an appointment with a big specialist who they thought would be able to help. So Rab Shalmardcha said, why don't you go to the greatest specialist of all? go to the Rebbe. He said that it's too hard for him and his wife to go to New York. So Rabashkin says, being that my birthday is 28th of Tishrei, I was planning on going to the Oil. I suggested, why don't you come with me to the Rebbe's gravesite and let's ask the Rebbe for bracha to have children. And Rabbeni now picks up the story and he says that he tried convincing me to stay after I told him that I'm leaving after Yom Tov, and suggested that we consult with doctors in America. I told him that we tried, no one had been able to help us. And so Shalmardche told Benny, you know what, I'm going to New York, I'm taking you with me, we're going to go to the Earl and ask for a bracha, which will be fulfilled. Benny says, I figured, he's in a Simchas Torah mood. I didn't take him too serious. A few days later, says Benny, I just finished working. There's a hoot on the car horn outside my house. I run outside, and there's Reb Shalmardche waiting in his car. As soon as he saw me, he started screaming, come quick, we're late for our flight. The airport is an hour away. We have to get into the car. He didn't even let us pack anything. Before we knew it, my wife and I were sitting in the car on the way to the airport. We went in a small jet with a handful of passengers in New York. Reb Shalmardche rented a car. We drove straight to the Ohel. We got to the Ohel around 2:00 in the morning. He brought us to a house adjacent to the cemetery. There was a big screen playing a video of the Rebbes, of the Rebbe distributing dollars, tables and chairs all over. This was the first time we were at the Ohel. It made a big impression on us. Reb Shalmardche offered us drinks. We weren't interested. We said all we want to do is daven for children and leave. He then informed us that the minhag is not to wear shoes when we go into the Ohel. There are a few pairs of slippers lying there, and he told us we can wear those. When we went into the Ohel, I must say that although living in Postville, Iowa, got me used to winter weather, the cold shocked me. There is no roof on top of the Ohel. There we were standing in the bitter cold, shivering from the freezing wind. After a moment, my wife said, enough is enough. She's going back inside. I tried to reason with her and convince her to stay a little. She refused to stay outside for even one moment. I said, listen, we came here all the way from Postville. This kind man purchased plane tickets for us, went through so much trouble to bring us here. Let's at least mention our names and ask for a blessing. She finally consented. We wrote down our names. I found a minor lashon, which is a group of prayers said at the gravesite. We stood by the Ohel alone. No one else, 2:00 that cold morning, was there, crying our hearts out. We ended up being there for quite a while, enough time for me to finish the minor lashon. We went back inside. Reb Shalmardche was waiting for some hot tea, and he himself went into the Ohel as well. After we finished, we drove straight back to the airport. We got back to Postville, and as Reb Shalmardche dropped us off at our home, he turned back to us and said, "Nu, are you still going to Israel?" My wife told him we had already scheduled an appointment, and to cancel after working was so hard, it didn't seem quite right to cancel. Additionally, we had already plane tickets, which would cost a lot of money if we would cancel. In short, our minds were made up about living for Israel. We thanked him warmly for everything he did for us and told him how we felt standing at the Ohel. And it filled us with such hope, such optimism and faith. We believed that our tefillos would be answered, but there was no change of plans. We were determined to leave. It took a few weeks, and a couple of weeks later, we are in Israel for our appointment. The doctor performed all the tests. We sat in the waiting room to hear the results. After about a half hour, the doctor came in and asked us impatiently, "What are you doing here? Why did you come to me? Don't you know that you're pregnant?" We both burst out crying, told the doctor the whole story. We called Postville to inform Reb Shol Mordche that the Rebbe's bracha was indeed fulfilled. We were going to have a child. Our son was born on Yud Beis Tammuz, which is also the birthday of the previous Rebbe and his festival of liberation. I remember calling Reb Shol Mordche excitedly and telling him that today is indeed a Chag HaGeula, a festival of redemption for my family. He replied that as he feels responsible for this child, he will take care of him. And he did exactly that. Once we came back to Postville, all expenses of our son came out of his pocket. For his upshernish, he hosted a big party for the whole community with a fully catered meal. It was such a beautiful event. My wife had a grandfather after whom she always wanted to give a name. In addition, throughout the first 4 years of our marriage, she had committed herself a number of times to give certain names in the hope that this would grant us a child. When our first son was born, we both knew we had to repay the Rebbe. My wife always told Reb Shol Mordche, "Don't worry. As soon as I finish with the names I'm obligated to give, the next name is for the Rebbe." Our sixth child was born on a special day, Yud Shevat, the time the Rebbe became Rebbe. This turned out to be our last child. He understands very well that he is here thanks to the Rebbe's bracha. When asked what his name is, he proudly answers, "My name," says the boy, "is Menachem Mendel. I am named after the Lubavitcher Rebbe." And Benny says, "I also have a very big picture of the Rebbe hanging on the wall in my house. People ask me, 'What are you, a Seret Vizhnitzer Chassid or a Chabad Chassid?' I answer them that I am a Seret Vizhnitzer Chassid, but no less a Chassid of the Lubavitcher Rebbe." Interestingly enough, this story is recorded when Reb Shol Mordche Rabashkin was still in jail, before President Trump commuted him on the last day of Hanukkah. And in that story, they ask us to pray for Reb Shol Mordche's redemption, which Baruch Hashem came. And so, my friends, whoever's listening to this, I want you to know that all of us have the opportunity to write to the Rebbe. There are different ways that people write. There's the Igris Kodesh. The Rebbe himself told people that first year and other years, write to the Ohel. And if you still feel connected to the Rebbe, he will find a way to answer. And the way you write is just go on ol.org or rebbe.org, and it'll tell you how to write. But now, as I said, we'd like to discuss how the Rebbe basically conquered the world. But I'd begin with the previous Rebbes coming to New York on the 9th of Adar Sheni in 1940. We discussed in previous sessions what an impact the previous Rebbe had when he visited America in 1929 and 1930. He had an impact beyond imagination. Everywhere he went, people were touched by him, impressed by him. He had thousands of people as crowds, to the extent that they wanted him to stay there. One of his conditions was that they establish a yeshiva, which wasn't ready yet. And so when he came to New York for the second time, he stayed in a place called Hotel Grayston. And it would be quite a while before 770 is bought. We can discuss that too. He stayed in Grayston Hotel for over a month. There was a very wealthy man who put up his mansion in Lakewood that the Rebbe went to for a visit. Then he went back to the Grayston Hotel and till they bought 770. But immediately, that same day that he came to Grayston Hotel, he announced that he called a meeting together to establish Untitled Lubavitch in America. And they had a yearly dinner to raise funds for the yeshiva. The Rebbe, previous Rebbe, you see in pictures at those dinners, spoke a few times. He is surrounded by his son-in-laws, Rabbi Shmayahu Garari, the Rashag, and our Rebbe sitting right next to him. On the fifth yearly dinner, the previous Rebbe spoke, and he said, I want to read for you a few lines in Yiddish of the Yuman, the diary that I wrote 4 o'clock in the morning, Wednesday, the 10th of Adar Sheni. So that was the same day that he came to America and established his yeshiva. He said, I trembling. Tuesday night, the 9th of Adar Sheni in 1940, the first day that I came to the land, after the great Kabbalas Panim, the great, all the rabbis who had come and delegation who had come to meet him and accompany him to the hotel Grayston, where I declared for everyone that I did not want to come to America. I was sent here by God, and I was sent here for a godly mission. And it is not lechol mipiria, not to retire, not to live comfortably, eating its fruit and enjoying all the good that America has to offer. My coming to America is by God's divine providence, and it is a neshama shlichus, and that is to cause the foundation, in Yirtzeh Hashem, of institutions that will spread Torah and Yiras Shamayim. And he says, we all know, by the way, The Rebbe's cry was, America is nicht anders, that America is no different to any other place that the Jews are, not Eastern Europe, not Israel, because God is beyond space, the Torah is beyond time, and wherever we are, we have to live by the spirit of Torah and mitzvahs. And he says, after I spoke, two people who were very, very close to me and good friends of mine came over to see me. And they said, what you did in der Alter Heim is beautiful, but we have to tell you about this sad, devastating American situation. We don't want you to become disappointed, because America is a place that consumes its inhabitants, so to say, and we feel it, our responsibility to help you avoid the loss of respect of your holy elders, our holy Rabbeim. Because if you put in all this effort and it fails, it's going to be basically a Chilul Shem Lubavitch. And the Rebbe writes, the previous Rebbe spoke this in public. And he said, the first one told me, America is a land oicheles gedolim v'toivim, that consumes the greatest. The frost is just going to take out, as I said, the greatest of the greatest, and it makes them to the smallest of the smallest without any America. And the second one says, that Rebbe told me that there is such a coldness in America, no one could be bothered with it. Nobody's interested in religion. We had many, many Gedolei Yisrael come here. By the way, this isn't mentioned here, but there was even a chief rabbi of New York who tried to bring in Yiddishkeit, and sadly, he died at a very, very young age. And they said, we're only warning you of a small warning. We want you to understand the true situation of America and Judaism. There's nothing here. We wish it could be different, but we have to tell you the honest truth. The Rebbe writes, how I felt after that, hearing the words from my entire Oihavim Nemonim, these two people who tried to throw cold water, says the Rebbe, were true friends. They meant my benefit. He says, I shed bitter tears, but in that first Krishma Sha'alamida, which I said on American ground, with the hope of Schus Aves Kedoshim, and with the encouragement, he said, of my father, who told me when he brought me into becoming his secretary and becoming involved with Askonas HaKlal in when I was only 15, which is in 1905. My father told me, says, the first principle when you're working with Askonas HaKlal is to have Mesiras Nefesh, to have total self-sacrifice, to bring the spreading of Torah wherever you are. And he writes, he says then, Baruch Hashem, God gave me chen v'chesed in the eyes of my close friends to help me in my neshama shlichus. And he says, thank God, after 3 years, we started spreading Torah and starting Teshuvah, and in 3 years, which was 1943, the previous Rebbe came out with the call, Li'alta L'Teshuvah La'alta L'Geula, that we have to do Teshuvah and we will be able to bring the redemption. And so he started the first Lubavitch yeshiva very, very soon after that. He started it that day, but it started with 30 students, and it spread to the to all different places. It started in 770, and they talk about buying the building on Bedford and Dean, and that yeshiva was under the directorship of his older brother-in-law, of the Rebbe's older brother-in-law, the Rashag. And then when our Rebbe came from Vichy, France to America in 1941, the Rebbe started different institutions, which we will discuss right now. The first one he started is called Merkas Linyonei Chinuch, which means Merkas is like an organization, a central organization for the aspects of education. And he wanted to start transforming the whole America into an aspect of Yiddishkeit. So, Merkas Linyonei Chinuch had many, many different missions and many activities. One of the first things that they did is actually a very famous thing called Tucks and Tails. By the way, I grew up in Tucks and Tails. It was a monthly organization, and the previous Rebbe says, when I arrived in this country in Oder Sheni, and I learned the situation in America and Canada, I understood that writing letters is not enough. It is necessary to provide Jewish educational literature. And notwithstanding the publishing costs, he began a monthly newspaper called Akriya V'Kedusha and Talks and Tales in Yiddish and in English called Shmusen. It would end up being in many different languages. He put the Rebbe in charge of it, as we will discuss shortly. Other things that Merkas Linyonei Chinuch was supposed to do is work with parents to let them know how important it is to educate their children al Tares HaKodesh, on purity. It wasn't enough to go to those Hebrew classes just for bar mitzvahs, where there were teachers who didn't keep Torah and mitzvahs himself. The other thing he started was educational places, and that is cheders, small yeshivas, camps, etc. And then he started a place for girls to start, which was the Beis Rivkes and the Beis Soras, which are under Merkas Linyonei Chinuch. He also started evening shiurim for those who worked during the day. And then he started in 1941, he started Shalom, which is called Shiurei Limud Hadas, which is release time for public school children, which I'll discuss at length. Hopefully we'll have time as well. And then he started also pedagogical lessons to bring people in how to teach Judaism. He started an organization called Mechanized Shabbos, which was very, very popular. I remember growing up with Mechanized Shabbos. My older siblings used to run Mechanized Shabbos, and that was in each place, in each shul, to gather the children together to teach them all about Judaism. And then he started a special division for farmers, because in the 40s, there were thousands of Jewish farmers who lived in places where there were no shuls and nothing like that. And he wanted to reach out to them. You know, my friends, even here in Johannesburg, do you have any idea? I mean, I just met some people yesterday, who have no idea about the truth of Judaism and what's it all about. They've been here since the 40s, and they just seem lost. And when we were discussing certain aspects of Judaism, you see how unfamiliar they are with these concepts. And this is what the previous Rebbe reached out. I remember when I was in LA, Rabbi Reitschek in the 70s was still going out to Jewish farmers, helping them with tefillin and educating them. Another division he started was what he called matzos. Matzos is to give people mezuzahs, tzitzis, and tefillin, and to help them with that. He started a very, very special division. Don't forget, this was in the early 40s. There were many Jews at war that were soldiers, and to find their spiritual needs to provide for them, to also print books for them, and that would be Merka Kahos, as well as the activities of Merkas. The way the Rebbe took this Merkas Linyane Chinuch and personally was involved with every inch of making sure that it worked and took off is something unbelievable. For example, with the farmers, he said there are tens of thousands of farmers throughout America who are Jewish, very far from any Jewish communities, and they could lose their whole aspect of Judaism. And so, because there's so few of them, there's no shuls, there's no mikvahs, there's no places of education. On the other hand, he said, they work for themselves. And so therefore, it is much easier for them if we teach them to keep Shabbos and all the temptations are not there. And so he wanted them to get involved with this. Another institution that the Rebbe started is called Machne Yisrael. Machne Yisrael at that time, he says, was much more in a hidden way. A part of Machne Yisrael was to work very quietly against Shmad. And they are, because there were many missionaries, there are still missionaries in Israel and elsewhere, trying to take Jews away from Judaism, Rahman al-Islam, onto other religions. And Machne Yisrael, one of its very big things was to help Jews to make sure that they wouldn't get into it. In fact, Rabbi J.J. Hecht, carried on with that organization called Anti-Shmad, and it did a tremendous amount of work, especially in the early 40s, in the war years, of trying to recover many Jewish children who were hidden in France and places like that, in monasteries. There's a very, very famous story told that I think it was Rabbi Silva who came to a monastery in France where people knew that there were many Jewish children that were put there by their parents before the parents were taken off to Auschwitz. And this was just after the war, and they wanted to regain the Jewish kids. And they went there with officials, so the monastery leaders couldn't just shoo them away. But the monastery leader said, there are no Jewish kids here. And they knew that it wasn't true. So with the help of the officials, the rabbis demanded that all the children come into this big hall. And the question was, how are they going to find out who was Jewish? And they had the idea. One of the rabbis, with a loud voice, he started to pray. He put his hand over his heads, and he cried out, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. And many of the children who were there, who had been brought up as Jewish children, it suddenly flooded back the memories. And they put their hands on their heads as they were shown when they were still with their Jewish parents. And that was one of the ways that they found the Jewish kids in that monastery. So this was one of the things that Mechanized Paper was very involved with. And another thing that it was involved with was purifying the air through Mechanized Paper. Everybody knows there's a big tumult going on now with climate change and the Paris Accords. This already was started by the previous Lubavitch Rebbe, when he said we have to purify the air with the learning of Mechanized Paper. And he also started a group for saying Tillim. And we know how many letters the previous Rebbe wrote, and he brought in the whole institution of saying Tillim every day. And he also started then the Chalukas Hashas, the giving to learn the Shas every year on Yud Kislev. All Chabad Chassidim would join in and take a Masechta. And another thing that the Rebbe started was Kahos, and hopefully we'll get time to go through all that. But I'd like to go into the history now, first of all, of the organization called Shalom. And it is a very, very interesting thing. And that was when the previous Rebbe came to America. There was no authentic Yiddishkeit at all. He established yeshivas, and they were not staffed well. So in 1942, the previous Rebbe wrote a letter to an American Talmud learning in Tomchei Tmimim and in Torah Vadas. And he said, let us start an organization without any political leanings, nothing to do with that, but rather to start an authentic education for all Jewish children, together with Merkez Linyonei Chinuch, and that is to conduct a census and to encourage people to send their kids to yeshivas. And that's what, and religious schools, and that's what they did. And then it came to the previous Rebbe's attention the following, that there is a bedrock of the American governing system, which is the separation of church and state. But in 1925, several non-Jewish religious organizations made a special arrangement with the school district of White Plains, New York, to allow children to attend religious classes for 1 hour a week off the school grounds and by teachers that are not associated with the school system. And it was a big tumult at that time. The lawsuit was brought by before the New York City of Appeals, and the justice system ruled that having religious instruction off school grounds was not in violation of any laws. And in 1940, they allowed that, the government allowed 1 hour a week to be set aside. A year after that law came into effect, mostly non-Jewish organizations took advantage of it. There were perhaps 25 Jewish classes in all of New York City because almost all Jewish organizations opposed the idea from the outset. And in 1942, Rabbi Chaim Tzvi Konakov was a rabbi in the Tzemach Tzedek Shul in Williamsburg. He learned about the release time program, and he started his own program in his shul, but he found it very difficult. He wrote a letter to the previous Rebbe describing the program and its potential. That letter was forwarded to our Rebbe, the chairman of Merkez Linyonei Chinuch. And in 1943, the Rebbe notified his letter was received, and Merkez is undertaking the task. He agreed with it completely, and that they are undertaking to start release time. Within a year, over 2,000 boys and girls were enrolled, and they got volunteers from many, many different yeshivas to teach every Wednesday. They had a special teacher's guide, and it was called Mittwoch Shah, Wednesday hour. And then in 1944, the previous Rebbe instructed Merkez to establish an official organization to lead the release time hours called Shor Limud Hadas, or Shiurei Limud Hadas, classes in learning religion. And it should be independent of Merkez, not a Lubavitch project. They got volunteers from Chaim Berlin, from YU, from Torah Vadas, in so many different places organizing for release time. The expense was extremely high because they needed volunteers to recruit students. You couldn't walk into the public school and announce that all Jewish children should follow them. Every parent had to sign a document asking the school to allow their children to go for that hour. So I remember going release time Wednesdays. It was 2 to 3. So the last hour of school, the children were taken out to a nearby shul to have religious instruction and thereby missing school for 1 hour. So he says they had to prepare locations, they had to offer treats, they had to buy supplies, and they were enrolled over 3,000. And finally, in the summer of 1945, Rabbi J.J. Hecht, Rabbi Yaakov Yehuda Hecht, was appointed to lead what they called the Central Foundation for Jewish Education. It was called then the CFJE, and then it called Release Time. And within a few years, 10,000 children were participating every single week in New York City alone. They put out many publications with that book and Shalom. And to show how important it was to the Rebbe, they say once on a Wednesday afternoon, a bacher was sitting in the Beis HaMedrash in 770 across the hall from the Rebbe's room. The Zal, where everyone studied, was empty because all the other Bachrim had gone to the release time. Suddenly, the light went out, and the Bacher looked up. He was astonished to see the Rebbe himself had entered the room and flipped the light switch. And the message was clear. Now is not the time to be studying. On Wednesday afternoon, everybody should be on release time. And for over 80 years, in fact, it is still going today, this aspect of release time. And in 1943, one of the Bachrim who was involved with release time wrote a letter to the previous Rebbe. He said, the activism is taking away time from his learning and distracts him while he is learning. And the previous Rebbe said that this is essential. He said, says the previous Rebbe, words are inadequate to describe the great merit one has from doing this holy work. All the supernal angels and the heavenly neshamas in Gan Eden are jealous of those involved in the mission of saving children, Jewish children, from the web of kfira, of antagonism to Judaism, spun by the apostate faculties of the Treifa Talmud Torahs, and bringing these children under the wings of the Shechinah, the proper Talmud Torahs. The previous Rebbe adds, the Mittler Rebbe said spiritual death is in fact worse than physical death. Imagine, he says, if you saw Jewish children drowning or trapped in a burning home, and you and your friends have the ability to rescue them from death, would you or your friends stand back and be concerned about your Torah learning? All the more so when you witness so many Jewish children drowning in this sea of kfira, of atheism, and being burnt by the poisonous kfira that they are being exposed to. How can you and your friends be concerned about your own Torah learning? You must all cast your lives aside and work with much mesidas nefesh and enthusiasm. It is the responsibility of the yeshiva bochrim to get this thing done. And he said, you must train yourself so to control your thoughts and go and do it. And the Rebbe himself says that even Moshe Rabbeinu, he says that Rabbi Aaron Cousin, who studied in 770 in the 50s, says, one year, my birthday occurred on a Wednesday. I was in Yechidus a few days earlier, and I asked the Rebbe, since it is my birthday, Should I go to the release time or should I skip it in order to learn more Torah on that day? Putting a great deal of emotion into his words, the Rebbe rejected the idea outright. And he said, Avad is also again. Of course you should go. Adding that I should teach the kids something extra special, especially because it was my birthday. And Rabbi Cousin says that a friend of mine wrote to the Rebbe. He wanted to be exempt from doing release time because he didn't think that reciting brachas with the children and giving them prizes accomplished much. Furthermore, it took 3 or 4 hours out of his day traveling to Coney Island and back. He felt his time would be better spent sitting and learning. He argued that the thought of knowing he would have to disrupt his studies preyed on his mind all week. So he asked the Rebbe, please exempt me from it. And the Rebbe wrote back to him and he said, I want you to know, all the neshamas in Gan Eden, even the soul of Moshe Rabbeinu, is envious of you because you have the opportunity to recite Shema with young Jewish children. The mitzvahs you do with those precious children certainly will have an everlasting effect. And there were many opposition from Jewish organizations, similar to the menorahs that we'll talk about sometime. And finally, the Supreme Court's decision came out that they have every right to do the release time. So this is just one little example of some of the organizations that were used for the Rebbe to conquer the whole America and through it the entire world. Another thing that both Merkez L'Inyonei Chinuch, if you saw the pictures, Mesilas Shabbos and Shiloh were very involved in, was parades. In 1943, they had a very big parade for Purim, and the Lag Bomer parades are very interesting in itself. I'd like to conclude before I tell the final story on the Shiloh. And I was there at that time, about the release time, that for the one time in history, on the morning of the second day of Sukkot in 1976, that was the Shnas HaChinuch, the year of education. After the Rebbe had given his Lulav and Esrog for the Chassidim to bench, he called Rabbi Meir Harlick and he said, did you see Rabbi J.J. Hecht? And a family member walked to East Flatbush and he said that the Rebbe is asking for him. After Shachris, Rabbi Harlick told the Rebbe Rabbi Hecht had arrived. The Rebbe asked Rabbi Hecht to come into his room and he said that he would like to have a special farbrengen in the sukkah, ending with Keishel Bracha for the release time children on Wednesday, the third day of Chol Hamoed. And the next day, he sent a detailed program. It set 770 a buzz. In less than 3 days, all the parents needed to be notified of this special opportunity, the logistics of transporting the children from their schools to 770. Only the children, their instructors, of which I was one of them, and those directly involved with the release time were allowed to be present in the sukkah for the farbrengen. There was only a minyan of Chassidim, handpicked by the Rebbe, to make hamoitzi, and it consisted of the Rebbe, 6 members of Maskiris, Rabbi J.J. Hecht, Rabbi Mordechai Mentlik, and Rabbi Beryl Yunik. At 3:15, the children joined the Rebbe in the shul for Mincha. 4:15, everyone was ready for the Rebbe to enter the sukkah. The program went as smoothly as it could, and the Rebbe, in fact, commented that the Farbrengen was very beautiful. 80 years later, release time is still going on today. And just by the way, during the Farbrengen of Shabbos Kiseitze in 1990, 2 days before the Shloshim of Rabbi J.J. Hecht, the Rebbe spoke about it, and he said that it is crucial to educate the children in order to bring Mashiach. So let us hope, Emir Hashem, that we can do that, and it just shows us. Thank God we have a Chabad house here who also prints many publications and do all that they can, with even Rabbi Masinto organizing all these webinars to educate. And I'd like to conclude with another story of the Ohel and how important it is for us to encourage people to write to the Ohel and to do the same ourselves. And this story is told by a Mr. Felix Slater in Port Washington, their annual dinner in 2010. He says, I would like to share a story with you. It happened to me and not too long ago. There's a man whose picture hangs here at my side called the Lubavitch Rebbe. Earlier today, I was at the Ohel to pray, to thank him, and to ask him for blessings. And true, my family and I are not religious, could be considered rather very modern. While I was there today, says Felix Slater, I was startled to meet Rabbi Sholem Moshe Paltiel, the Chabad rabbi of Port Washington. By the way, the Sholem Moshe Paltiel is married to my niece, so technically he is my nephew. And he told this story about a Michael Samuel. And this is the story that he told. I started a business transaction with people who I would consider anti-Semitic, Muslims from Arab countries. It was a real estate transaction that was taking place in Turkey. I didn't believe it was going through. One day I was discussing my doubts with Rabbi Paltiel, and he said, you should go visit the Rebbe about this. I willfully agreed. We drove to the Ohel together, and to be honest, he says, I was a bit timid. I thought this was more of a religious ritual or something to that effect. But the rabbi corrected my motion and said, make this a partnership. The Torah talks about giving 1/10 of your earning to charity. Promise the Rebbe that you will give 1/10 of the profit that comes from this transaction to charity, and you can be sure that all will go well. And that's precisely what I did. I wrote a note to the Rebbe, and I hoped for the best. I traveled to Turkey to do the transaction. Can you see me still?
Yes, now we can. You disappeared.
Okay. Sorry. So the guy says, I wrote a note to the Rebbe, hoped for the best, and I traveled to Turkey where we did the transaction. But when it was time to get paid, nothing was forthcoming. I got a phone call from a representative of the other side who said, sorry, there's no money for you. We've already used it for another business. Perhaps at a later stage, we'll come up with something for you. I was devastated. When I got home, I called Rabbi Patil and explained things are not going well. They're anti-Semites. They don't see a reason to pay me. I'm never going to get paid. And the rabbi interrupted me. And he said, just a second. Isn't this the same deal about which we visited the Rebbe? You have another partner in this deal. Go to the Rebbe and tell him what's happening. Guy says, initially I was reluctant, but we drove over to the Ohel. Port Washington is not far from it. And very late at night, the rabbi and I reached the Ohel. I began to write a note to the Rebbe, something to the effect, you must help me collect the money. I promise to give a large portion of the profit from this deal to tzedakah, and I wish I'll be able to carry through with it. We arrived back at my home at 1:30 in the morning. As we sat in my driveway, the rabbi attempted to enliven my spirit a bit and assure me that everything would turn out all right. I wasn't convinced. To me, the situation seemed hopeless. One thing I can assure you, there was no way in the world that these people ever intended on paying me. They felt no need to do so. Why pay a Jewish boy from New York for a transaction that took place in Turkey? Especially given the fact that I already dealt with these same people over a year before, and they had stiffed me on that last deal as well. When they had called me earlier to tell me they wouldn't give me the money, I had asked them to at least pay in small installments or even partially. They wouldn't hear of it. It was a sleepless night for me. When I awoke just a few hours later at 5:30 a.m., I noticed there was a text message waiting for me on my phone from the lawyer of the other side. It read, don't worry, tomorrow we're sending you the money. I was not sure what to think. As I mentioned, I had asked them to give me at least something, so I thought that they may have resolved to pay me only symbolically. When I arrived at work the next morning, that morning, in fact, there was an email awaiting me from my bank. It was hard to believe it was true. Not only had they paid me in full for this transaction, but they had already paid up also, together with this, the transaction of over a year ago. One would have expected they would have called me soon after to request something of me, or to at least allow me to express my appreciation, but they didn't. I want to tell you, he says, this is by no means a coincidence. By the laws of nature, it was impossible for this to have happened. I believe from the bottom of my heart, as does my family and everyone else who knows about this transaction, that this was the work of the hand of Hashem through our holy Rebbe. I'm not that religious of a person to be standing here and saying this, but it is true. And he said, my friends, if you ever need anything, something, anything, be it success in business, health for a loved one, or for whatever it might be, I urge you, go to the Rebbe, go there and pray and ask for your blessings. And my friends here in South Africa, we can do the same by going on Rebbe.org or oil.org and writing to the Rebbe your name, your mother's name. And he says, if you open your heart and you really want it or need it, It'll happen for you. I am living proof of it. So my friends, a good vach, and let's remember, the Rebbe is our Rebbe, and he is still ready to listen to us, to hear our prayers, to pray to God to fulfill them. And let us work together to pray to God to bring Mashiach, and may it happen very, very soon. A good vach.
Good vach. And Rabbi Carlebach, your knowledge is unbelievable, and thank you for those very, very inspiring stories. Tomorrow evening, Rabbi Shishel will be speaking on atomic energy, the Rebbes take on it, and that'll be at 8 o'clock. And next Sunday, for those interested, we'll be doing a virtual experience at the Ohel. I will send out an email to everyone. How it works is on the Thursday or Friday before you write your letter to the Ohel, and then we will email it to the Ohel, and somebody will take those letters in, and we will go with the person inside the Ohel. It's an unbelievable experience, but I will email everybody this coming week. Rabbi Carlebach, thank you again, and everybody should have a good one. Have Mashiach immediately.
And we should take advantage of that virtual visit to the Ohel. Definitely.
So maybe you lead it, Alex. I'll speak to you during the week.
Okay.